Let's talk about the external buttons and controls of the Canon 77D and the T7i. The first and most important button on the camera is the shutter button. This is a two-phase button, meaning that it has two positions. The first is a halfway depression, and the second is a full depression that will actually take the picture. The halfway depression is used to engage the focusing and metering systems of the camera. It's very important to teach your finger to feel the difference between those two positions because sometimes you're going to want to focus and other times you're going to want to fire the shot. Just behind the shutter button, we have the main selection dial. I also refer to this as the primary selector for a very good reason. You're going to be using it to help change exposure settings depending on which mode you are in. The third most important dial is on the back of the camera. You can't miss it. It's a big wheel. This is referred to as the quick selection dial by Canon, but I like to call this the secondary selector for a very good reason. This controller has many different types of functionalities built into it. It is a rotating wheel which will help us change some of the exposure settings, and when we are selecting a focusing square, we can push it up, down, left, or right to change the square. And you will also notice that inside of the wheel, we have these little icons, which allow us to change when pushing up, white balance, to the right, our autofocus modes, down is our picture styles, and to the left is our drive modes, which is what the camera does after we push the shutter button down all the way. Because we're here and talking about the secondary selector, it's probably a good idea to point out that this wheel is not available on the T7i, where instead we have 4 directional buttons. You'll also notice that we lack the Q button, which is on the 77D, and instead we get an exposure control button. The T7i is also missing a lock switch, and on the top of the camera you will notice that we do not have an LCD, and the mode dial is moved to the right with a power switch next to it. There is also an autofocus on button on the 77D that we do not find on the T7i. These are some of the core differences in terms of buttons and controls between the T7i and the 77D, but for the most part, the cameras operate very similarly. On both cameras, in the middle of the directional pad, we have the set button, which acts as an enter or return button similar to a computer. This allows us to select certain menu items and enter into those menu features. The mode dial is located on the top left of the 77D and on the top right of the T7i. The mode dial allows us to change which shooting mode we are in, whether it's an automatic mode or a creative mode where we change the exposure settings. Very important to note that in order to rotate the dial, there is a center button that we need to push down while rotating. This button prevents us from accidentally bumping the mode dial and changing the settings. Out of all the buttons on the camera, these are the ones you're going to be using the most. Let's take a look at some of the other secondary buttons and controls. On the front of the camera, opposite of the shutter button, midway down we see an oval button. This is our lens release. We're going to need to push this down and rotate the lens every time we want to remove a lens. When you put a lens on, be sure to rotate it all the way until you hear a click indicating that the lens is locked. Below the lens release, we have the depth of field preview button. This allows us to see the depth of field in real time when we push this down and look through the viewfinder. Just above the lens release, we have the force flash button. This allows us to activate our internal flash for things such as fill flash or any other times we need to use it. Under the rubber gaskets on the left, we have our external ports, which include our wired remote port, our microphone port, USB 3.0, and our HDMI port. On the 77D, just to the left of the viewfinder, we have our power switch, and you'll notice there's a video icon there for shooting motion pictures. Just below the power switch, we have the menu and information buttons. The menu button is very important because it allows us to access the deep menu of our camera and tweak many of the custom controls. I'll be talking about this in much greater detail in another lesson. Press the info button repeatedly to cycle through different types of shooting, display, and playback information. Very handy. I use it most to inspect the images when playback. such as the histogram or other critical shooting information. The garbage can icon is the delete button. You're going to take pictures that you're going to want to delete, press this to do so. Press the playback button to review your images. You can scroll through them by swiping on the touch-sensitive pad or by using your secondary controller. This mechanical switch here, found on the 77D, is the lock switch. It's not on the T7i, but it will allow us to lock certain features so they will not change accidentally if we bump them. I never use it, but it's definitely convenient if your camera is bumping against your side and you run into this problem. The Q button allows us to access the quick menu, where we can use the back monitor to change our exposure and secondary settings. This is the Wi-Fi icon, which allows us to turn on our camera's Wi-Fi, enabling us to use things such as the remote app, download images. Super handy feature, and I'll have another lesson on this later on in the course. This little wheel right here next to the viewfinder is called the diopter adjustment. It allows us to adjust the focus, and it's very handy for those of us who wear glasses. To the right of that, we have the live view video record button. If you are shooting in a photography mode, this is going to activate live view. If you are shooting in the video mode, this is going to start and stop video recording. Near where our right thumb would rest, we see 3 buttons on the 77D and 2 buttons on the T7i. The Auto Focus On is a customizable button which allows us to engage our focusing systems. This is great if you like back button focusing, and in live view, this will become your primary focusing button. Next to it, we have the exposure lock button. This allows us to freeze our camera's exposure settings in the P, S, or A modes, so when we recompose, the exposure settings stay the same. I have a little lesson on this later on in the video. The third button is the Auto Focus Point Selector. This is going to be required every time we change our focusing points when looking through the viewfinder. You'll also notice we have these 2 little magnifying glasses beneath these last 2 buttons. They allow us to zoom in and out of our images during playback so we can scroll through many at once, and we can also use the touchscreen monitor to pinch in and out if we wanted to inspect. On the top of the 77D, we have a small LCD. This is going to show critical shooting data such as our shutter speed, our aperture, our ISO, exposure compensation, things of that nature. If we want to change, for example, our ISO setting, we would push the ISO button and then rotate our primary or secondary selector. Immediately to the left of the ISO button, we have the Auto Focus Area button, which I like to refer to as the cluster selector. This is going to be required to change your focusing cluster types when looking through the viewfinder. And again, I'll explain this in the focusing lesson a little bit later on in the course. To the right of the ISO button, we have the LCD light, because if you're shooting and it's dark, this is very handy to be able to see what your camera settings are without turning the monitor on. Beneath the right hand grip, we have our SD card slot, and underneath that, we have our battery port. So that is an overview of the Canon 77D and T7i. I know it's a lot, but if you study this and practice, the day will come that you will have complete control over your camera, and it feels really good to know how to do everything. It's sort of like learning how to ride a bike the first time. Once you understand you have that control, it feels awesome. Now, there may be some times you forget which button does what. Just come on back and we'll go over it again. For the rest of the crash course, we're going to go over each of these buttons in detail, including real-world shooting situations. If you found this video helpful, you might be interested in my Canon 77D T7i crash course. I'll teach you the basics and show you how to shoot like a pro in no time. You can order it from the following link.